Auntie Basiratu, where are we going?
Come on, hurry up!
What are you doing? Are you trying to kidnap my son?
Byum-suk, I am not stealing your son. I am trying to save him before it is too late, before she gives him the last dose.
What last dose? What are you talking about?
Your wife is not healing him, she is killing him. Slowly. The same way my daughter Adetutu was killed, and I can't stand by and watch it happen again without doing something about it.
The scream of the wind against the 52nd floor of Gangnam Tower residences was the only sound loud enough to cover her footsteps. Basiratu pressed her back against the cold marble wall of the service corridor, her heart slamming so hard she was certain it could be heard through the walls. In her arms, wrapped tightly in a blanket stitched from her mother's old Ankara cloth, 7-year-old Jiho lay limp, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. It was 3:07 in the morning. Seoul never really slept, but this particular hallway, lined with imported Italian marble and hushed automatic lighting, felt like a tomb. Basiratu's bare feet were freezing against the floor. She had left her shoes behind in her rush, too afraid that the sound of them would wake the house. In her free hand she clutched a small plastic container she had fished out of the kitchen trash less than 10 minutes earlier. Evidence, she prayed, of everything she had suspected for the past 6 weeks. Evidence that could either save this child's life or destroy her own. She reached the elevator bank and pressed the call button, glancing over her shoulder every second, whispering a prayer in Yoruba under her breath. Come on. Come on. Jiho stirred against her chest, his eyes fluttering half open. Auntie Basiratu, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. Where are we going? Somewhere safe, my darling, she whispered back, kissing his forehead. Somewhere safe. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime that sounded, in that silent hour, like a gunshot. And that was the exact moment the lights of the hallway flooded behind her, and a voice she knew all too well roared through the corridor like thunder cracking over the Han River. What are you doing? Basiratu froze. Fully she turned. Standing at the far end of the hallway, still in his silk pajama shirt, hair disheveled from sleep, stood Yul Byum-suk, the man who had flown her here from Lagos, the man who had trusted her with his dying son, the man whose face was now twisted into something between fury and heartbreak. Are you trying to kidnap my son? His voice cracked on the last word, shaking with a rage that barely masked the terror underneath it. Basiratu's knees nearly buckled. For a moment neither of them moved. The elevator doors, sensing no one entering, slid closed again beside her, sealing off her only escape route. She was trapped between a locked stairwell door and a man who looked, in that instant, capable of anything. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot against the cold air. She held up the plastic container in her trembling hand, along with a folded sheet of paper stained with damp fingerprints. Byum-suk, she said, her Korean broken, tangled with desperate English. I am not stealing your son. I am trying to save him. Before it is too late. Before she gives him the last dose. Byum-suk's eyes narrowed. What last dose? What are you talking about? And what Basiratu said next in a voice shaking with 2 years of grief, guilt, and a promise she had made to God after burying her own daughter, would shatter the world Byum-suk thought he had built. Your wife, Basiratu said, is not healing him. She's killing him. Fully. The same way my daughter Adetutu was killed. And I can't stand by and watch it happen again without doing something about it. To understand how Basiratu Adeyemi came to be standing in that hallway at 3 in the morning, holding a dying boy and a container of poison, you have to go back 2 years, to the day the doctors at Seoul National University Hospital first sat Yul Byum-suk down in a quiet room with soft lighting and told him, in the gentlest voices they could manage, that his son was dying. Before we get into this shocking and intriguing story of deception, betrayal and spite, hit like, drop a comment and subscribe. Because what happens in the next few minutes will make you question everyone you have ever trusted. Suk was, by every external measure, a man who had everything. At 39, he had built a successful biotech software company from a garage apartment in Sinchon into a firm valued at 622 billion won. He lived in a penthouse so exquisite like those that appeared in magazines. He owned a fleet of cars that cost more than most people's homes. And yet none of it, not one of it, could buy back his son's failing health. It had started small. Ji-ho, only 5 at the time, began bruising easily. Then came the fatigue, the swelling in his abdomen, the strange yellow tinge that crept into his eyes. Blood tests followed. Then biopsies. Then a parade of top-notch specialists, each one more baffled than the last. "It presents like a genetic metabolic disorder," one doctor finally said, "but the markers don't match anything in our database. We've never seen a case quite like this." What none of them said was that Ji-ho's illness wasn't genetic at all, because none of them knew yet. It was being made one careful teaspoon at a time. 3 years before that meeting, Suk had lost his first wife, Mabel, a bright, warm Nigerian woman he had met while studying software engineering in Boston. She had died suddenly after her heart gave out to a cardiac arrest battle. Though Suk, if he was honest with himself in his darkest hours, had never fully accepted that explanation. Grief had swallowed him whole. And when Ji-ho's illness began, grief curdled into desperation. Desperation, as it so often does, made him vulnerable. That vulnerability had a name: Seo-yun. She arrived in his life through a mutual business associate, introduced as a traditional wellness consultant, with a reputation for helping terminally diagnosed patients find comfort, sometimes even remission, through what she called integrative Eastern medicine. She was elegant, soft-spoken, endlessly patient with Ji-ho, and utterly devoted, at least on the surface, to nursing him back to health. Within 8 months, Suk had married her, driven less by love than by the desperate hope that she might be the miracle his son needed. But guilt gnawed at him too. Guilt that he had remarried so quickly. Guilt that his son was growing up without a single relative from his mother's side of the family, surrounded instead by Seo-yun's cold, sterile world of imported herbs and locked cabinets. So Suk made a call to Lagos to his late wife's older sister, a woman named Basaratu Adeyemi, and asked her to come to Korea. "The doctors say he may not have long," Suk had told her over a crackling video call, his voice hollow. "I want him to know his mother's family before whatever happens next." Basarata had said yes before he even finished the sentence. She saw this as an opportunity to be close and show love to her late beloved sister's son, because she was still grieving her demise too. The penthouse that greeted Basaratu when she arrived in Seoul was nothing like the warm, chaotic, noise-filled homes she had grown up in and later built for her by her other siblings in Lagos. It was silent, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering Han River, pale marble floors that echoed every footstep, and furniture so pristine it seemed less like a home and more like a museum exhibit of what a home was supposed to look like. From the very first hour, Seo-yun made it clear that Basaratu was an inconvenience to be managed, not a family member to be welcomed. "You will stay in the guest wing," Seo-yun told her that first evening, her tone polite but glacial. "And please, for Ji-ho's sake, do not interfere with his treatment schedule. He is on a very precise regimen. Any disruption could be dangerous." "I only wish to spend time with him," Basaratu said gently. "He is my sister's son." Seo-yun's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. But this is a modern household, Ms. Adeyemi. We follow evidence-based integrative protocols here, not superstition. I'm sure wherever you're from, home remedies have their place. But not in Ji-ho's treatment. He is far too fragile for experimentation." The insult was wrapped in silk, but Basarata felt its edges all the same. She said nothing. She had come too far, and Ji-ho needed her too much, for her to let pride start a war she couldn't win. Over the following days, the pattern repeated itself in 100 small cruelties. Basaratu was seated last at meals. Her opinions on Ji-ho's care were met with tight, dismissive smiles. When she tried to braid his hair the way his mother used to, Seo-yun accidentally interrupted, ushering Ji-ho away for his medicine hour. When Basarata spoke to him in fragments of Yoruba, teaching him words his own mother would have wanted him to know, Seo-yun remarked within earshot that it was confusing for a sick child to juggle so many languages. Byum-suk, buried in work and grief and the exhausting business of hoping, noticed none of it. Or perhaps more painfully, he noticed and told himself it didn't matter, because Seo-yun was the one keeping his son alive, or so he believed. But Basarata noticed everything. She had spent years in Lagos as a community health volunteer, and she still carried, folded somewhere behind her ribs, an old wound that had never fully healed. The death of her own daughter Adetutu 11 years earlier. Adetutu had been 6 years old when a fever wouldn't break. The village elders in her hometown, Ibadan in Oyo State, respected and beloved, had insisted on a traditional healer rather than the clinic 2 hours away. A healer who mixed roots and prayers with a confidence that seemed like wisdom and later, in hindsight, looked like recklessness. Basaratu had wanted to take her daughter to the hospital. But she was young then, only 23, newly married, and petrified of defying elders who had buried and blessed 3 generations of her family. By the time she finally overruled them and carried Adetutu to the clinic herself, it was too late. The girl died in her arms on the back of a commercial motorbike en route to the hospital. Basarata had made a vow at her daughter's graveside, one she remembered every single day since. Never again will I stay silent while a child dies in front of me. Never again will fear of what people think cost a life that could have been saved. So when she arrived in that cold Gangnam penthouse and felt her instincts scream the moment she looked into Jiho's tired, yellowing eyes, she did not dismiss the feeling as jet lag or grief or imagination. She listened to it the way she wished, more than anything in this world, that she had listened 11 years earlier. And what her instincts told her was this. Something about this treatment did not add up. It began with a smell. Every morning at exactly 7, Seo-yun would disappear into her private study, the one room in the penthouse that stayed locked at all times, even from the housekeeping staff, and emerge some minutes later with a small ceramic cup of dark, viscous liquid she called Jiho's traditional ginseng restoration tonic. She would present it to him with theatrical tenderness, always in front of Byum-suk if he happened to be home, always accompanied by a gentle reminder of how expensive and rare the ingredients were, imported personally from a healer in Anong whose lineage, she claimed, stretched back 6 centuries. Basaratu, who had taken on the role of tidying the kitchen simply to have something useful to do in a house that made her feel like a ghost, noticed that the tonic had a smell beneath its ginseng sweetness, something bitter, almost metallic, that reminded her uncomfortably of the smell that used to cling to certain roots sold in the darker corners, roots that experienced herbalists warned never to combine. She said nothing at first. She told herself she was imagining things, that grief and worry were making her paranoid, that she was a guest in this house with no right to question a wife's care for her own stepson. But every day Jiho grew a little weaker. And every day that tonic was administered with the same ritual precision. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, with Byum-suk at the office and Seo-yun called away for what she said was a personal appointment, Basarata found herself alone in the hallway outside the locked study, and the door, for the first time in weeks, was standing slightly ajar. Her heart hammered. She knew, even as her hand reached for the door, that she was crossing a line from which there would be no retreat. If she was wrong, if this was simply an eccentric woman's private ritual space, she would be branded forever as the paranoid, disrespectful foreign relative who couldn't be trusted in a decent home. She might be sent back to Lagos before Jiho's final months were through. But she thought of Adetutu and her beloved sister, Mabel. And she pushed the door open. Inside, shelves lined with labeled glass jars rose from floor to ceiling, dried roots, powdered barks, coiled dried mushrooms, each meticulously catalogued in careful Korean script. Most of it meant nothing to Basra. But tucked behind a row of prized wild ginseng roots, in a jar with no label at all, sat a handful of dark curling leaves that stopped her cold. She knew that leaf. She had seen it once before years ago in the hands of a traveling herbalist near Ibadan who had warned her, in hushed and serious tones, never to let anyone brew it carelessly. In small, isolated doses, It had legitimate uses in certain traditional treatments. But combined incorrectly with other compounds, particularly certain bitter root extracts common in East Asian tonics, it became something else entirely. A slow, cumulative liver toxin, nearly undetectable in early stages, easily mistaken for a degenerative organ condition. Basarata's hands shook as she photographed the jar with her phone, then carefully pinched a small sample of the leaf into a folded tissue, tucking it into her bra before hurrying out of the study and closing the door exactly as she had found it. She had found her proof. Now she needed someone to confirm it. Through a Nigerian fellowship group she had found online during her sleepless nights, Basarata reached a young woman named Chidinma, a doctoral candidate in biochemistry at Yonsei University who had grown up close to Basarata's childhood home in Lagos. It was a fragile thread of connection, but in a city where Basarata knew almost no one, it was the only thread she had. "Please," Basarata had begged over a shaky phone call. "I know this is strange. I know you do not know me. But a child's life depends on this. I need someone to test a plant sample. I cannot go to a hospital or a police station, at least not yet. I have no proof they will believe, only a feeling and a leaf." Chidinma, to her enormous credit, did not hang up. 3 agonizing days later, during which Basarata watched Jiho grow visibly weaker, his skin taking on a deeper jaundiced hue, his appetite for even his favorite foods disappearing, her phone rang again. Chidinma's voice was trembling. "Sister Basarata, I ran this through the university lab, off the record with the help of a professor I trust. This isn't medicine. Whoever is preparing this is combining Urawa with a bitter root compound that's common in certain unregulated Korean tonics. Individually, both are relatively survivable in small doses. Together, over time, they attack the liver in a way that mimics genetic degeneration almost perfectly. If someone is using this to treat anyone, like you said, then the person is deliberately shutting the patient's organs down slowly on purpose. If this has been going on for months, he may already be in serious danger. You need to act. Now." Basarata sat on the edge of her narrow guest bed for a long time after that call ended, staring at the wall, feeling the full weight of what she now knew crash over her. He thought of going straight to Byum-suk. But she also knew, with the particular clarity of someone who has been dismissed and diminished in this house for 6 weeks straight, exactly how that conversation would go. She was the poor foreign aunt with no medical degree, no Korean citizenship, no standing in this family beyond blood. She couldn't even prove her relationship. Seo-yeon was his wife, poised, credentialed, beloved by his business associates. The woman who had, in his eyes, given him hope when the finest doctors in the country had given him none. If Basarata walked up to Byum-suk and accused his wife of poisoning his son with no evidence beyond a leaf and a phone call from a graduate student, she would not just be dismissed. She would very likely be put on the next flight back to Lagos before she even finished her sentence. And Jiho would be left completely alone with the person actually killing him. She needed more. She needed something undeniable. And she needed it before the next dose was administered. That night, after Seo-yeon left for a late business dinner with an important herbal supplier, Basarata slipped into Jiho's room while Byum-suk was still finishing calls in his home office 2 floors below. Jiho was awake. Propped against a stack of pillows Seo-yeon had specially imported traditional Korean buckwheat hull pillows she insisted were essential for neurological healing and detoxification while he sleeps. Basarata had noticed over the past week that Jiho complained of headaches and strange dizziness almost exclusively at night, hours after his evening tonic, hours he spent with his face pressed against those very pillows. "Auntie Basaratu," he whispered, his small voice thin as paper, "I don't feel good. My head is spinning again." "I know, my darling," she said softly, sitting beside him, smoothing his damp hair back from his forehead. "I know. I'm going to help you. I promise you, on your mother's grave, I am going to help you." She picked up one of the pillows, testing its weight in her hands. It was heavier than a pillow of that size should be. Her fingers found a seam along the underside that had been restitched, the thread slightly different from the rest, slightly newer. Her heart in her throat, she tore it open. Sewn deep into the buckwheat filling were 3 small satchel bags, each leaking a fine, strange-smelling powder with every movement of the pillow. A powder designed to be inhaled slowly throughout the night, every single night compounding whatever was already being fed to him through the tonic each morning. It wasn't one method of poisoning. It was two working in tandem, each one disguising the other, each one engineered to look on any hospital chart like the slow and tragic march of a genetic disease no doctor could name. Basarata's hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the satchel steady enough to photograph it. She gathered the bags, the leftover tissue with the leaf sample, and the printed lab summary Chidinma had emailed her, folding them all into a single bundle. And then, with Jiho growing sleepier and more disoriented by the minute from a dose he'd likely already absorbed hours earlier, she made a decision that would either save his life or end her place in this family forever. She was not going to wait for morning. She was not going to wait for proof to be perfectly, unassailably complete. She had made that mistake once already, 11 years ago, waiting for someone else's permission to save a child's life. She would not make it again. She wrapped Jiho in the Ankara blanket she had brought from home, and lifted him into her arms. "We are going somewhere safe," she whispered. "Just for tonight. Just until your father understands." That was the moment the elevator chimed. And that was the moment Byung-suk's furious voice tore through the silent hallway, freezing her in place with a dying boy in her arms and the entire truth of the household clutched in her other hand. "Byung-suk," Basarata said again, her voice raw, "listen to me. Please. For the sake of everything you loved about my sister, listen to me before it is too late." Byung-suk's chest heaved. Every instinct in his body told him to call security, to have this woman removed from his home and his life immediately. But something in her eyes, he recognized from his own reflection in the mirror during the darkest nights of his son's illness, made him hesitate. 5 minutes, he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have 5 minutes to explain why I shouldn't call the police right now." Basarata laid Jiho gently on a nearby sofa, tucking the blanket tighter around him, and with trembling hands unfolded the bundle she carried. She showed him the photographs of the unlabeled jar. She showed him the satchel bags pulled from the pillow, still faintly dusted with powder. She read him Chidinma's message, translating the biochemistry into plain, desperate language. "Your wife is not healing him," Basarata said, tears streaming freely now. "She is killing him. Fully. The same way a healer once killed my daughter out of ignorance back home because everyone was too afraid to question the person everyone trusted. I could not save Ade Tutu. I refuse to fail your son the same way." Byung-suk took the papers from her hands, his own hands beginning to shake as he read. He wasn't a chemist, but he was fluent enough in scientific documentation from years of running a biotech firm to recognize the shape of real evidence when he saw it. The university letterhead in Chidinma's forwarded lab notes, the precise chemical terminology, the specific compound names that matched disturbingly in both the leaf residue and the powder from the pillow. And then, tucked at the very back of the folded bundle, a printout Basaratu had found weeks earlier and kept, unsure of its meaning until tonight, was a document from a private insurance firm in Seoul. A life insurance policy taken out 8 months ago on the life of one Kim Jiho, age 7. Beneficiary, Seo-yeon Kim. Value 3.2 billion won. Payable in full upon death from illness, with an accelerated payout clause for diagnosed terminal degenerative conditions. Byung-suk's knees genuinely buckled then, and he had to steady himself against the marble wall. The room seemed to tilt around him. He had spent 2 years and a fortune he could barely calculate chasing a cure for his son, trusting the one woman who had promised to deliver it, never once imagining that the treatment itself was the disease, that every spoonful of tonic every night spent on those imported pillows had been another quiet step toward a payout that would only clear once his son was gone. "I didn't just marry a woman who couldn't save him," he whispered, more to himself than to Basaratu, his voice hollow with horror. "I paid her every month for 2 years to end him." What Byung-suk did not yet know, what even Basaratu in her exhaustion and adrenaline hadn't fully pieced together, was that this was not Seo-yeon's first wellness consultancy. 3 days later, once Jiho had been stabilized in intensive care and the initial shock had given way to a grim, methodical investigation, a detective assigned to the case pulled records that made the truth even darker than anyone in that penthouse had imagined. Seo-yeon Kim was not her birth name. Under 2 previous identities she had married twice before. Once to a wealthy widower in Busan whose chronically ill teenage daughter had died under similarly unexplained circumstances 18 months into the marriage, and once to an elderly art collector in Daegu whose sudden degenerative decline had conveniently coincided with a matured life insurance policy naming her sole beneficiary. Both cases had been quietly closed at the time, written off as tragic but natural. No one had connected the pattern because no one had looked, because grief-stricken, wealthy families rarely wanted to reopen wounds that had already painfully begun to close, and because the woman at the center of it all was so believable, so gentle, so endlessly patient in front of witnesses, that suspicion simply never found purchase. Basaratu, when she learned this from the detective days later, felt something cold settle into her stomach. She was not the first foreign relative Seo-yeon had dismissed and diminished. She was simply the first one who had refused to stay quiet. Basaratu thought of the widower in Busan, a man she would never meet, who had buried a daughter he believed had simply drawn an unlucky card from fate. She thought of the art collector's family in Daegu, who had mourned an old man's natural decline, without ever questioning why his final months had been so meticulously documented by a wife who stood so patiently to inherit. 2 families, an ocean away from her own grief, had walked the same road she once walked with Adetutu, trusting the wrong voice, burying a loved one, never once suspecting that grief itself had been manufactured for profit. The detective told her and Beum-suk gently that neither of those earlier cases could easily be reopened after so many years, but that Jiho's case, verified, documented, undeniable, would very likely become the piece of evidence that finally connected all 3. You didn't just save one boy, the detective told her. You may end up being the reason 2 other families finally get the truth they were denied. Basaratu said nothing to that for a long moment. She simply held Jiho's hand a little tighter and thought of her daughter's grave half a world away, and hoped that somewhere in whatever place mothers go to watch over the children they couldn't save, Adetutu understood that her death had not been meaningless after all. Seo-yeon returned to the penthouse just after 5 that morning, expecting to find a sedated boy and a household still asleep. Instead she found 2 patrol officers waiting in the marble foyer, and Beum-suk standing behind them, his face carved from stone, holding the very jar she had believed no one would ever find. She tried for a moment to maintain her composure, the same practiced serenity that had charmed doctors, business partners, and 2 grieving husbands before Beum-suk. Honey, what is this? Has something happened to Jiho? Don't, Beum-suk said, his voice quiet in a way that was somehow more terrifying than shouting. Don't you dare call me that again. The officer stepped forward. Seo-yeon's mask slipped for exactly 1 instant, just long enough for Basaratu, watching from the hallway with Jiho's small hand held tightly in hers, to see something cold and calculating flash behind those soft, practiced eyes before the officers led her away in handcuffs, her protests of innocence echoing off marble that, for the first time since Basaratu had arrived in that house, finally felt like it belonged to someone who cared what happened within its walls. At the hospital, the doctors worked through the remaining hours of darkness running toxicology panels that, for the first time in 2 years, were actually looking for the right thing. By 4 a.m., as the first hints of gray dawn crept over the Han River outside the hospital windows, the head toxicologist delivered news that made Beum-suk sink into a chair in the hallway, his head in his hands. We found it, she said gently. A compound interaction consistent with what you described. Chronic low-dose exposure to a hepatotoxic combination, both ingested and inhaled. It's rare. Frankly, in 20 years of practice, I've never seen a case exactly like this. If this had continued even another few weeks, the damage to his liver and heart would likely have become irreversible. We caught it just in time to begin reversing the worst of it. Just in time. 3 words that would echo in Basaratu's mind for the rest of her life. 3 words that stood in painful, beautiful contrast to the 3 words she had never gotten to say for her own daughter. Too late. Byung-suk looked up at her from the hospital corridor bench, his composure so carefully maintained for 2 years in front of doctors and board members and mourners at his first wife's funeral, finally breaking completely. "I almost had you sent home," he said, his voice cracking. "That first week. I told myself you were being paranoid, dramatic, and difficult. I told myself Seo-yeon knew best because she had credentials and calm hands, and I was too exhausted to keep fighting doctors who had no answers. I nearly sent away the only person in this entire city who was actually trying to save my son." Basarata sat down beside him, and for the first time since arriving in Korea, she reached out and took his hand, not as a subordinate, not as an outsider, but as family. "You did not fail him," she said quietly. "You loved him so much you were willing to trust anyone who promised you hope. That is not weakness, Byung-suk. That is what grief does to a good father. What matters now is what you choose next." In the weeks that followed the arrest, the story of the Kim household could not stay contained within marble walls for long. Word moved quietly through Seoul's business circles. First a hushed conversation at a board meeting, a raised eyebrow at a charity gala, before a journalist covering the wider fraud investigation connected the dots between 3 grieving households and one endlessly patient woman. When the full story broke, it did not paint Byung-suk as a victim of naivety as he feared it might, but as a father whose public unraveling and rebuilding resonated with anyone who had ever trusted the wrong voice out of sheer exhaustion and grief. Letters arrived at his office weeks afterward, many from strangers who had lost parents or spouses to illnesses that, in hindsight, had never quite added up. Byung-suk answered every single one personally. It was, he told Basarata one evening, the least he owed to the families who might never get the clean, decisive justice his son had been lucky enough to receive. The Kim household, 6 months on, was almost unrecognizable to anyone who had visited it before. The locked study that once smelled faintly of bitterness and secrets had been gutted, its shelves emptied and its contents handed over to investigators, then rebuilt into a sunlit reading room lined with books in 3 languages: Korean, English, and, thanks to the very patient tutor Basari Yoruba. Ji-ho, now recovering steadily under the care of a genuinely qualified hepatology team, had color in his cheeks that no one in that house had seen in over 2 years. He ran through the penthouse now instead of shuffling, his laughter loud, unrestrained, thoroughly undignified by the old household standards echoing off marble that no longer felt cold. He had picked up a charming, tangled hybrid of Korean and Yoruba phrases from his aunt, delighting in surprising his father's business associates with a cheerful, "E Carrero," before switching seamlessly back to formal Korean greetings, as though defying anyone to tell him he could only belong to one world. Byung-suk had done more than simply thank Basar. He had established a medical scholarship foundation in Lagos in her name, more quietly in the name of a little girl named Ade Tutu whom he had never met but whose memory, he now understood, had saved his son's life more surely than any doctor in Seoul ever could have. But the gesture Basarata treasured most had nothing to do with money at all. It was smaller, quieter, and infinitely more meaningful. A permanent seat at the family table, her name added to the deed of a small apartment 2 floors below the penthouse that Byung-suk insisted was hers for as long as she wanted it, and a standing invitation, extended without a hint of obligation, to be present for every one of Ji-ho's birthdays, every school recital, every ordinary Tuesday dinner, for as long as she lived. "You are not a guest in this family," Byung-suk told her one evening, watching Ji-ho chase their new puppy across the balcony in the gold light of sunset. "You never should have been treated as one. You are the reason my son is alive. You will always have a place here." There were smaller moments, too, in those 6 months, that mattered just as much as the grand gestures. Evenings when Basar taught Ji-ho to pound yam badly in a too-small Seoul kitchen, both of them dissolving into laughter at the mess they made. Afternoons when Byung-suk, still learning how to simply sit with his son without the anxious hovering of 2 years of fear, asked Basaratu to teach him 3 words of Yoruba so he could greet his son the way his late wife once had. A quiet morning when Ji-ho, drawing a picture for a school project titled My Family, included 4 figures instead of 3. His father, his aunt, his puppy, and tucked in the corner with wings, a small figure he labeled in careful 7-year-old handwriting, Amma in heaven watching. Basarata framed that drawing herself. It hung from that day forward in the reading room that used to be a locked study full of secrets. Proof that a house built on fear and silence could, with enough courage, be rebuilt into something that finally deserved to be called a home.
There is a particular kind of arrogance that mistakes wealth, credentials, and polish for wisdom, and a particular kind of blindness that comes from grief, so deep it makes a desperate man trust the wrong voice, simply because it speaks softly and confidently. Biamsak had surrounded his son with the finest doctors and the most expensive care that money could buy, and none of it had saved him. What saved Jiho was a woman with no medical degree, no social standing in that household, and no language fluency to argue her case eloquently. A woman who had nothing but a mother's instinct, a promise made at a grave, and the courage to act on what she knew to be true even when everyone around her made her feel small for knowing it. Sometimes God, or fate, or simply the quiet persistence of love sends exactly the person everyone else has chosen to overlook, because that is precisely the person who was paying attention all along. If this story moved you, don't scroll past without hitting that like button, dropping a comment below telling us what part shocked you most, and subscribing for more stories where the truth finally comes to light. Also, let us know in the comments section where you are watching this video from. Share this with someone who needs the reminder. Never underestimate the person everyone else ignores. Thank you for watching.